So welcome back, and we're going into the afternoon session of shorter papers. And I think after Miles very comprehensively set out the broader history, and particularly the sort of actors involved across all government levels, construction companies, suppliers, designers, and then the afternoon sessions are somewhat organised around that. I'm speaking for Philip here, but that's what it looks like. That the Commonwealth, first at this stage, we're concentrating then on the Commonwealth government associated schemes, particularly in this session, and then state government and then more sort of regional developments. So I think without much further ado, the first speaker in this session on Commonwealth Solutions is Dr. Daniel Ryan from the University of Sydney, who's really talking about this idea of tropicalizing, a sort of generic solution, I guess. So welcome.
Well, firstly, just wish to acknowledge Wurundjeri and Woi-wurrung, and the land of the Bunurong peoples, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. So this talk is slightly cheeky talk, but hopefully you'll join me for the ride. I'll start, I guess, by just noting that Northern Australia, like its southern counterparts, suffered, or I guess, from shortages of labour and materials during and in the aftermath of the Second World War. But for Northern Australia, it was particularly an issue due to the bombing of Darwin and Townsville in 1942, and this reignited calls for development north of Capricorn. Post-war planning for many of Northern Australia's boosters, such as public health officiants Raphael Salento or DHK Lee, was a means to bring to fruition plans for really a tropical ethno-state where science could be called on to allow white settlers to thrive, or at least to stop them from leaving. Histories of prefabrication in Queensland, the Northern Territory, and Papua New Guinea after 1930 are quite thin on the ground, and mostly are found within theses and articles in housing policy after World War II, such as, for example, Robin Hollander's work. If we go back to 1974, though, Ray Sumner suggested that after the 1930s, there was little interest in prefab in Northern Queensland until 1960, when it once more was considered a solution for remote areas. And I'm not quite sure that really holds true. But migrant and Indigenous experiences of post-war prefab housing, I guess, are beginning to be looked at, and I'm sure we'll hear more about them afterwards, and also really looking forward to Anoma and Maria's work, which I think will touch on some of the themes I covered. But perhaps the best study of the contractual and political history of prefab in Queensland, I think actually at a local level, is Alphonse Vernooy's study of Dutch contracted housing in the Brisbane suburb of Coopers Plains. Indeed, Vernooy sets out both the desperation of the authorities for ready-made solutions to the post-war housing crisis and the ensuing disappointment with the quality of the end result. And in this talk, I'd like to look at some of the initial build-up of interest in prefabrication as a solution for tropical Australia and New Guinea, and challenge the assumption that progressive architects were all fully behind it. One of the curious things about prefabricated buildings, though, is both the desperation that gave rise to the design, the optimism and faith by architects and officials in their future, and the mild bemusement of the public in the reception, and the frequent stories of disappointment in their aftermath. So optimism. Well, young architects in Australia's southern states, such as Robin Boyd, Arthur Baldwinson, Charles Harden, Walter Bunning, strongly advocate for prefabrication's solution to Australia's housing shortage. Indeed, Bunning in 1942, in a feature in the Sydney Morning Herald, ticked almost every trope about the prefabricated house, that houses could be similar to cars, that the building industry had largely remained unchanged since Roman times, and that while the approach was only just beginning, quote, prefabrication may go down in history as one of the great developments born of the urgencies of this war that will remain as a permanent benefit to civilization. Quite a claim. During the war within Queensland, architects advocated prefabrication up to a point, but were less enthusiastic afterwards compared to in New South Wales, where Bunning and Baldwinson, both members of the Mars Group, played leading roles. The Queensland Bureau of Industry's investigation into tropical housing and its aftermath shows some of the tensions at play. Formed in 1942, the six-member committee included some of the most prominent public servants, academics, and architects in the state. Among them were Sir Raphael Salento, Director General of Health, Colin Clark, an economist and director of the Bureau of Industry, D.H.K. Lee, Professor of Physiology, University of Queensland, Leo O'Connor, Manager of State Advances Corporation, and representing the Australian Institute of Architects was E.J. Weller, alongside Robin Cummings, who represented the Board of Architectural Studies, University of Queensland. Their report, presented to the Minister in March 1943, contained an amalgamation of medical ideas about tropical physiology and white settlement, population predictions, and also saw a role for prefabrication within this mix. The report emphasized the need to alleviate the fatigue of housewives and to find architectural solutions to encourage permanence, chiefly through paying more attention to climate and building scientifically. This continued the racialized acclimatization agenda that came to the fore in the early decades of the 20th century, with the implementation of the notorious White Australia policy that placed greater weight on building construction and scientific research. The historian Warwick Anderson recently outlined that in the 20th century, modern and tropical were no longer antithetical, and that culture and racial assumptions about the tropics were changing due to technology. The 1943 Tropical Housing Report placed its faith in scientific method to modernize and climatize housing and suggests the prefabrication of building and equipment units would create improved houses at lower cost, provided there was not undue emphasis on eye effect or patent protection, and that climate was taken into account. Prefabrication is also championed by the Commonwealth Housing Commission, chaired by Leo O'Connor, who also formed part of the Queensland Bureau of Industry's Tropical Housing Committee. The commission also included prefabrication evangelists like Walter Bunning and architect Charles Howard. And Howard in 1943, while a member of the Commonwealth Housing Commission, actually suggested the creation of the experimental building station. It was really Howard who set in train that sort of process and modeled along the lines of the Building Research Station to test and develop prefabricated buildings. The 1944 report, the CHC's final report, expected that the scale of output required after the war, the lack of skilled labor, and the expanded use of factory production would all stimulate the reorganization of the building industry and increase the need for prefabrication. They considered prefabrication a viable solution for tropical and rural housing. And what's interesting, I think, is that the proposed designs for standard houses at the back of the report in the southern part of Australia made no mention of prefabrication. Those for the tropics, subtropics, and rural areas were all expected to be prefabricated. So you can kind of just see this up here in the thing there. It's just sort of notes. It's like based on prefabricated modular framework, and that's sort of there. So just that small note, I think, is of interest. What's surprising is that though the Queensland Bureau of Industry's work up in Queensland foreshadowed later work by the Commonwealth Experimental Building Station into developing climatic design factors for housing, and consisted of some of the more progressive members of the Queensland architecture profession, such as E.J. Weller, and even they roped in Carl Langer to do some of those plans that you saw earlier. They didn't place the same emphasis on prefabrication. Langer's subtropical housing did suggest, for example, the possible use of prefabricated building components, but his sort of work often, it seems to kind of be much more about climate and lifestyle than on construction per se. So a bit of misplaced enthusiasm. E.J. Weller, Jim Weller, who was at times the garrulous nominee of the Queensland chapter of the Institute of Architects, would have at first seemed to be a potential advocate for prefabrication, but if anything, subscribed to the view of the architect as a skilled tastemaker who'd facilitate a modern lifestyle without requiring major reform of the construction industry. An architect who trained in Sydney with Burley Griffin's associates, Weller was also a member of the Institute of Sanitation Engineers and had done a study of that. In fact, there's an article, some of his articles in architecture are worth looking again. There's one that really goes into climate and health. And I think actually someone needs to put that in play with Carl Langer's work. I just discovered it the other week. And I think that'd be quite interesting. And he was proficient self-publicist who garnered considerable local attention in the press in the late 30s for densifying inner city sites in Queensland and Townsville with small-scale apartments, such as these ones here. If anything, Weller highlights the interest in developing a local culture of architecture among Queensland architects and a mistrust of universal approaches. He was alarmed by the Commission's announcement of an experimental building program and thought it was rushing into solutions without probing the economic significance of any investigation. Issues he thought relevant included local availability of materials and production potential, and the adaptation of war industry, at least in part, to the production of housing components. This is in 1943. Weller feared that prefabrication was being forced on the public and that few people would trade a loss of choice in the dwelling for a small saving in construction cost. Far from being a permanent benefit to civilization, as Bunning had claimed, Weller thought the rush to experimental housing solutions was misplaced enthusiasm. But where did it kind of come about? Well, prefabricated houses were accepted by government as a quick fix solution to accommodation shortages. In Darwin in 1949, the Administrator of the Northern Territory, Arthur Driver, gave his reluctant support to purchase 100 Hawksley houses, noting in a draft letter that we do not like them, but we can see no other way clear to obtain the necessary number of dwellings, and the project should accordingly have our and the department's blessing. End quote. Officials understood that the appearance of the buildings and the level of thermal comfort they provided were below what many in the community expected, but given the dire situation in accommodation, they were willing to compromise. And these are just some of the things in the file actually on the Hawksley house. And here's another one. This was the Hawksley house for Woomera. Initially, the public also agreed. Hawksleys were also sent to Papua New Guinea, even though they were considered inferior to the other pre-cut homes, such as the R-type house, and weren't considered exactly ideal for tropical conditions. Their finish and appearance were acceptable, given the alternative of living in a makeshift dwelling. One thing I think that's interesting, though, is that there seems to be little effort to galvanize public support for prefabs in Queensland and the Northern Territory. So while the Meyer and Beaufort homes were displayed in Melbourne and Harry Seidler's prefabricated house in 1954, that House of the Future went on show in Sydney, I actually can't find any examples of prefabricated homes being displayed to the public in Brisbane, for example, during the 40s and 50s. And even though there were exhibitions organised by the University of Queensland on the future of Brisbane in 1940 and 44, there was no mention that I can come across in the press, certainly about prefabrication. There was a press article by Minister of Housing in 1951 who pushed the need for imported housing, but it's unclear whether the public ever got to experience a prefab before moving in. So, disappointment. Many of the great plans for prefabricated buildings by state and Commonwealth housing agencies ended in disappointment. Certainly the claims that the factory-made houses would be cheaper and better performing failed initially to materialise. In 1942, Bunning had suggested that a prefabricated house could be built for £350, yet 10 years later, Hawksley houses in Darwin cost £5,145. Even allowing for inflation and the cost of site work in remote locations, this was far above the standard cost of housing elsewhere at this time. The importation of prefabricated dwellings from Europe in the early 1950s by the Queensland Housing Commission was also considered a debacle. The prefabs at Zillmere, north of Brisbane, became a battleground between state Labor and federal Liberal parties in 1952. Their accusations of poor workmanship, defective materials, and householders getting dysentery. Alans Vernooy is kind of the son of the main contractor for the Dutch houses, considered the concrete Dutch house at Cooper Plains to be a housing debacle. Some of the problems that emerge include poor site infrastructure, materials unsuited to local conditions, and poor workmanship. And I think this thing about site conditions is something that often gets missed in discussion about, there's one thing to have the prefab house, but you often needed a contractor to actually do it and to set up the place. And that often created extra expense and trouble as part of it. In 1951, northern Brisbane suburb of Zillmere, a development of French-made prefabricated dwellings for the Queensland Housing Commission. Well, there was issues about site infrastructure, and there was examples actually given of raw sewage being carted across the suburb and dumped into an open sewer where it built up and caused considerable health risks. Site drainage was so poor that the suburb was considered also a dengue risk. It was a funny thing though too, there's also obviously histories of migration with the importation of the houses. There's a lovely part where there's actually a photo of the workers, and the problem they were seeing actually was a French company were from Alsace, and some of the workers were found out to be German, which was a problem, but they were good looking, so all was okay. And they were quite good looking actually, fellas. So, yep. However, prefabricated dwellings continue to be built, with those for the Rum Jungle in the Northern Territory among the better known. So in conclusion, EJA's Weller's warnings about rushing into solutions seem prophetic. Perhaps one way of looking at prefabricated dwellings can be found in an article in Architecture Reform in 1942, which introduced a special issue detailing it dedicated to prefabrications. In it, the editors start by noting that, quote, prefabrication is all things to all men and a source of confusion to many. But it's the paragraph afterwards that perhaps get at another consideration for prefab. That's essentially a cult. As the editors noted, it's obscured by a fog of claims and counterclaims, and yet manages to rise above this fog as one of the few widely recognized objectives of a rudderless industry. Its basis is not so much a logical theory as a cult, and as a cult, it is one ardent and pervasive adherence united by a belief in a better house for less money through more efficient methods of house production. Some of the characteristics of cults include a belief in magical powers, a cult leader, group elitism, exorbitant financial demands, a severing of ties with the original social environment, bypassing of traditional economic networks, indoctrination of the young, infiltration of authorities, legal problems, alternate lifestyles with risk of exclusion, and humiliation in the case of opposition. While it's stretched to find all of these characteristics, certainly we can find many. Whether the remoteness of some of the locations played a role in accepting the failings of prefab, though, perhaps could also be better explored. Okay.
Yeah. So I just want to kind of preface this, that this research is really at its early stages, and I'm using this paper to kind of test some connections that I hope to kind of explore later on with more detailed archival work. And so there's a bit of a disjuncture between some of the images on my slides and kind of the housing policy that I'm introducing, but it gives you a sense. The Commonwealth Government's journey of reconstruction and nation building after the Second World War contributes to economic prosperity, and although the 1950s were punctuated by economic fluctuations, this trajectory during the late 1940s and 50s in part generates a political and wider social emphasis on house ownership as a method of economic and cultural securitization that inscribes itself in the national imagination. The detached suburban house built with climate considerations and adapted to local environments gained momentum as the ideal housing type for Australian citizens, and by extension becomes adopted as arguably a defining attribute of Commonwealth citizenship and definitely a public fixation. In this period, the hazy notion of the Australian dream takes flight and becomes an ongoing magnet for cultural commentary, both affirmation and criticism. The circulation of the Australian dream linked house ownership to economic stability, but it also culturally grounded understandings of home and emplacement in the settler colonial context of the Commonwealth in these type of physical forms. Graham Davison, in his key article, Australia, the First Suburban Nation, discusses the suburban boom in Australian cities in the 1950s and 60s and the emergence of a property-owning democracy that was spatialised through the suburbs. In a range of design-orientated publications aligned to the architectural industries, as well as broader newspaper supplements in The Sun and public magazines such as House and Garden, this housing type becomes synonymous with the idea about what constitutes ideal forms of housing and, by extension, the physical and spatial incarnation of home. This short presentation introduces the conceptual framework and key questions for a larger research project that interrogates the political narratives and motivations encircling the Commonwealth's involvement in housing research and provision in the immediate post-war period. This larger project aims to explore the colonial underpinning of housing histories and the political apparatuses behind the generation of housing ideals, and how this impacts design research undertaken on behalf of the Commonwealth and its dissemination into the wider architectural profession in subsequent years. By situating the Commonwealth's directives to address the housing crisis emerging in the final years of the Second World War, in the context of the growth of owner-occupied housing in spreading suburbia, the research aims to consider the relationship between housing and colonial emplacement, and how this emerged through government-sponsored construction innovation slanted towards domestic architecture. An emphasis on land ownership through housing in this period and its legacy signals a modern manifestation of colonial trajectories, with scholars such as Senya Gnu arguing that colonial apparatuses are palpable in the expressions of the modern nation state through the management of its populations. And you could kind of argue seen here through the prevailing housing ideologies and the provision it engendered. What the broader project hopes to explore is the scale of involvement the government had in the adoption of house ownership as an aspirational aim, and how this possibly informed the design outcomes it produced. During the period from the late 1940s into the 1970s, the federal government both produced and financed a large amount of this type of suburban housing stock as part of public housing efforts. However, it's important to note that the role of the nation state in the expansion of owner-occupied housing, specifically the level of its orchestration and interference in the widespread endorsement of home ownership aspirations, has been heavily debated by political and social historians such as Alistair Gregg. But Commonwealth government policy did aim to encourage certain housing tenure types and the promotion of a mono-tenure system with owner-occupied at the centre, I suppose, undergirding this kind of larger housing agendas surfacing from the Commonwealth, particularly from the mid-1950s onwards, with the renegotiation of the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement in 1956. The Commonwealth Housing Commission was established in April 1943 to address the future housing crisis and the diminishing quality of Australia's housing stock. And it kind of operated as a commission over 1943 and 1944, set up with two rather broad primary aims: to present the housing position in Australia and to inquire and report on the future housing requirements. Generated as one of three commissions of inquiry from the Department of Post-War Reconstruction that was established in 1943 with Chiefly as minister, the others being the Rural Reconstruction Commission and the Secondary Industries Commission. The CHC was an accumulation of departmental recommendations and a real kind of network of bureaucracy there, namely by the 1941 Interdepartmental Committee that advised on reconstruction, identifying housing as a major post-war concern stemming from the Depression. The CHC constituted mainly of architects, and Orion has already outlined this a little bit, but John Stevens Gawler, a former lecturer in town planning and architecture at the University of Melbourne, and Charles Vincent Howard, an architect in the Department of Interiors. The Commission's executive officer was Walter Bunning of the later firm Bunning and Madden that practiced as partnership from 1946. Bunning's influential 1945 publication, Homes in the Sun, The Past, Present and Future of Australian Housing, emphasises designs responding explicitly to geography and climate, and he significantly contributed to the CHC reports of 1944, and as is kind of outlined earlier, was quite a supporter of early kind of investigations into prefabrication. The firm Bunning and Madden would go on to have involvement in both the Commonwealth and state housing projects, with the redevelopment of the Villawood Migrant Hostel from 1968 to 1970 and flats in Sydney for the Housing Commission of New South Wales, such as the Phyllis Burke Court of 1968 with its two interlocking concrete blocks. A key member of the Commonwealth Housing Commission was Mary Margaret Ryan, a former nurse who had worked in women's welfare organisations and was interested in community infrastructure as connected to housing developments. And in many ways, she ensured that wider community views were included in the CHC's examinations and the compilation of material, including substantial plans and drawings. And she was also, I suppose, a large figure in the publicisation of the Commonwealth Housing Commission reports. Patrick Troy argues the Commission was a substantial inquiry and a major policy piece that included 948 witnesses visiting 53 towns across all states, resulting in an output of 2 interim reports and a substantial final report. In the CHC's final report, Part 4 charts the need for the Commonwealth Government to participate in housing, partly as a continuance of wartime controls. Troy has argued the setup of the CHC and its finding was one of Australia's most significant welfare policy initiatives, namely for its legacy in public housing provision, particularly in the late 40s and early 50s. Although they're beyond the scope of this kind of inquiry for research questions, the CHC set the groundwork for the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement of 1945, with an emphasis on public housing until it is updated in 1956, which saw substantial Commonwealth funds directed away from public provisions to boosting private home ownership through building societies, lending institutions, and amongst other initiatives. As part of its recommendations, the Commonwealth Housing Commission proposed the creation of the Commonwealth Experimental Building Station, founded in 1944, and it was set up to foster immediate and more experimental solutions for the post-war housing shortage, and kind of looked at through trailing cost-effective on and off-site fabrication methods and new construction technologies in the collaboration with industry partners such as Jennings Constructions and Stewarts and Lloyds. A decline in traditional residential construction materials from the war-orientated industries meant that part of the CEBS's program was developing low-cost prefabricated steel and concrete houses as viable alternatives. By discursively examining the Commonwealth's interest in housing research propelled by the post-war housing crisis, next to the development of housing ideologies, in particular the entrenched spectre of home ownership and its long-lasting effect on housing trajectories, this research raises questions about the aims of the Commonwealth-produced housing, as well as the politicisation of the domestic sphere, offering a platform to interrogate how narratives of nation building curated a particular framing of national identity as positioned in parallel to the ideas and preconceptions about political, social, and aesthetic role of housing in Australia. Raising the question of how the design innovation the Commonwealth Experimental Building Station fostered is connected to the wider political climate of the 1950s, namely the influence of the Cold War and its impact on the government's framing and delivery of housing. The link between the politics of home ownership, the shadow of the Cold War, and the building of a constituency for Menzies government's brand of conservatism in the 1950s has been investigated by John Murphy. And the aim is to situate these established discussions in relation to the evolving program of the Commonwealth Experimental Building Station in the 50s. It is conceivable that there are links to be made between the national economic development, as Murphy argues, in terms of self-reliant industrial facilities in readiness in the Cold War, and that the expansive immigration programs were also part of, and how this, in a way to bolster labour, I should add, and how this may have influenced the type of projects the CEBS was interested in and undertook. The Commonwealth Housing Commission's recommendations focus on providing financial frameworks and for the Commonwealth to overview the planning and construction to be carried out by state and local government. And under this were suggested administrative organisations such as the National School of Physical Planning, and along with the Experimental Building Station that could enhance these wider suggestions. Arguably, material labour shortages rather than explicit shortages of finance was a driving factor in the recommendation for a dedicated site of prototyping from the CHC. The station was initially under the jurisdiction of the Department of Post-War Reconstruction and then moved shortly to the Department of Works and Housing and relocated its base to in Sydney. In an early cabinet proposition for the building station, the impetus for housing construction research was outlined. The Commonwealth Housing Commission has indicated to this department that to build houses more economically than before the war, new methods of construction will have to be developed and existing methods rationalised. This will require research and experimentation with both existing and new construction methods. Much of the investigation cannot be undertaken without facilities for constructing experimental buildings, which can be subjected to weather conditions and other practical tests. The station was conceived and practiced as collaborative partnership partnership with the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, CSRI, a buildings research laboratory, documented in publications and internal reports. The CEBS prototyped built projects located in Canberra, Sydney and Melbourne during the late 1940s and 50s, and often in partnership with the state housing commissions. And architecturally orientated research has focused on how its work impacted the profession both within the nation and internationally, namely in its work on thermal performance and prefabrication methods. And this includes J. Williamson Scholarship that documents the division of building research work on thermal performance in response to local climates. Daniel Ryan's more recent work offers an alternative approach in that it explores the complications around thermal performance research in relation to the CEBS's international reception in an expanding transnational interest in design sensitized to tropical climates. And I suppose my research aims to complement this existing scholarship by investigating the CEBS's research as connected to immediate post-war national housing projects, and to consider whether an analysis of technical records offers an additional dimension to the spatial ideas in circulation about residential architecture. Australia's housing crisis in the 1940s and 50s propelled an unprecedented interest by the Commonwealth Government in housing, resulting in the setup of the CHC and formalised research into material and structural innovation through the CEBS. The idea is here to use the CHC and its findings as a basis to examine select initiatives of the building station and how this was connected to other housing projects simultaneously emerging from the Department of Works, as well as the Department of Labour and National Service, and possibly how it informed kind of formal trends. The station's emphasis on housing solutions was signalled with priorities including the design of a low-cost house suitable for tropical climates, development of prefabrication mechanical equipment unit for low-cost houses, and developing concrete houses. Like many government-funded initiatives, the CEBS history was marked by administrative debates around its purpose under the strategic aims of successive departments and governments. From the agendas informing the setup as outlined and selective surveys of unpublished reports show an invested interest in improving house construction, with house prototypes centred on the detached house and nuclear family plan. Through further archival work, the aim is to interrogate understandings of house and home on a national scale and the legacy of cultural and economic preferences in federal housing agendas. And in doing so, it asks how the persistent trope of house ownership as a method of securitization became so ingrained in the national psyche at the possible restriction of substantial investigation into other forms of collective dwellings. What it asks is what were the complexities and the limitations to design-based solutions in providing increased output and accessibility to cost-effective housing options. The broader research this framing introduced aims to consider these questions of design experimentation as they were informed and inflected by catering for different housing programs as they shifted across iterations of post-war social planning. To examine how the types and forms of Commonwealth housing and who gets priority to access are intrinsically linked to the then government's social engineering and population control measures that were introduced after the Second World War. For example, seen in how assimilation policies and processes influenced the adaptation and construction of accommodation allocated to migrants and refugees arriving to Australia as part of various assisted passage schemes. That's it.
This case study of post-war prefabricated housing concerns the naval cottages erected at Lower Georges Heights in Sydney, erected for the married naval personnel involved in the post-war National Service Training Scheme. This case study is based on our heritage assessment study and detailed research report carried out in 2003, 20 years ago, for the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust, with research by Terry Cass and Noni Boyd, which was subsequently provided by us to Al-Shabib and Ridgeway for their article in Fabrications in 2020. Georges Heights is one of the former Commonwealth defence lands around Sydney Harbour, administered by the Commonwealth Government's Sydney Harbour Federation Trust since 1988. Georges Heights is indicated by the arrow in the left map of Sydney Harbour, and the location of the naval cottages is indicated on the right map of Georges Heights with a very dark black arrow. 7 cottages were erected in Middlehead Road at Lower Georges Heights, adjacent to the HMAS Penguin Naval Base at Middlehead, and the cottages are shown in the row of buildings above Middlehead Road, numbered 1 to 7. An 8th cottage was erected at Upper Georges Heights, and Miles will show you an external view of that cottage at Upper Georges Heights. 5 of the 7 Middlehead Road cottages were slated for demolition in the Trust's management plan, subject to further investigation, and our 2003 study was that further investigation into their possible significance. The 8th cottage of the same type at Upper Georges Heights was not then under immediate threat of demolition. At the time of our commissioning for the heritage assessment of cottages, they were presented as poorly maintained asbestos cement clad houses, and their origin was recorded as English Riley Newsom houses in the Register of the National Estate. This slide shows the horizontal AC weatherboards and also the vertical timber boards in the gable, the chimney at the end of the house, the living room corner window, and the porch with the glazed front and end wall. And I mention these because those details are important distinguishing features. It also shows the squared corrugations of the aluminium roof sheeting. Our assessment report contained a detailed history by historian Terry Cass of the post-war Commonwealth housing mission to Europe and the USA, investigating prefabricated houses. Repetition of that part of the study is beyond the scope of this talk, but the history section of the report can be made available for those who are interested, as it gives a detailed account of the Commonwealth housing mission, as well as correspondence between the government and the Åmåls Sågverks Aktiebolag, or ASA, the Åmåls sawmilling company. Our research in the National Archives of Australia confirmed the cottages were erected for married naval personnel after May 1951, as confirmed by a May 1951 aerial photograph which showed a vacant site. This May 1951 site plan located at the archives confirmed the approximate site layout, but the final arrangement of the houses on the site was not strictly as per this plan, as only 7 cottages were finally erected on that site in slightly different orientations. Now, within the legend of that drawing, there's a thumbnail sketch floor plan of the typical house to be erected on the site. This plan was identical to the floor plan of the houses as erected. However, there was no indication on this drawing of the origin of the house's design. An important discovery was the Department of Works and Housing drawing HA1671, dated April 1951, in other words, preceding that previous drawing. That consisted of 4 sheets of drawings depicting the plans and elevations of 11 prefabricated house types that were sourced from England, Sweden, Norway, and Australia. This sheet 1 depicts English examples. It depicts also the Commonwealth Works and Housing example, and at the bottom, the English Riley Newsom type CA1 house, for which the Georges Heights cottages were mistaken. Sheet 2 has yet more Hawksley houses from England. Sheet 3, Australian examples and the Swedish ASA house. And sheet 4, a Norwegian house, another English house, and a further Australian example. The drawing, these 4 sheets of that drawing number included 2 floor plans identical to that shown in the legend of the Naval Cottages site plan of May 1951, and another very similar plan. And I've brought them together on this slide. So the top one is the Housing for Commonwealth Employees, 3-bedroom type, Department of Works and Housing drawing HA1497, which is on the upper one. And it's worth noting it's got 8-foot ceilings. I won't give you the dimensions, but it's got 8-foot ceilings, so remember that. The central one is the Riley Newsom CA1 house with reference to their drawing ACT19750. It's also got 8-foot ceilings. And sheet 3 of the multi-drawing set depicts the Åmåls Sågverks Aktiebolag house with reference to drawing number 5493. And this house was depicted with 9-foot ceilings. Whilst the plans are identical in layout, the dimensions are different. The Commonwealth house is smaller in length and width and has 8-foot ceilings, compared with the ASA house's larger dimensions and 9-foot ceilings. The Riley Newsom house is longer but narrower than the ASA house and also has 8-foot ceilings. So this drawing series was the first documentary evidence of the possible correct origin of the Georges Heights cottages. as the Raleigh-Newsome house depicted on the drawings was similar to, but still sufficiently different in detail to the Georges Heights houses to be discounted as correct origin. And as I mentioned earlier, the corner window, placement of the fireplace, etc., is very different in the two top examples. So the top and the bottom example compared with the Raleigh-Newsome in the central example. Our measured drawing of one of the naval cottages gave plan dimensions closest to the dimensions of the Commonwealth Works and Housing House. The naval cottages were approximately 44'8" by 22'9" with 8-foot ceilings. The same length, but 1 inch wider than the Commonwealth House and 1 inch narrower than the ASA Type 302. However, this poses the question as to who designed the cottages. Was the house an ASA original design and the Commonwealth Plan an alteration of the size of the house to reduce cost? Or was the house designed as a collaborative effort by ASA, as represented in Melbourne by the Åmåls company and the architects of the Commonwealth Department of Works and Housing, also then based in Melbourne? Our 2003 research did not progress beyond posing this question, and subsequent research that we have seen has not progressed beyond our supposition that the design was the result of collaboration, or of at least critical input between ASA and the Commonwealth architects. Our investigation of the building fabric in 2003 revealed vertical timber shiplap cladding remaining under the asbestos cement weatherboards that matched the still visible vertical boards of the ventilated gable ends. Now this slide, it's to interpret the slide, lying on the ground underneath the house, looking up the outside wall. It shows from the bottom of the slide the floorboards, then the edge floor joist, the ends of the vertical timber shiplap boards, the timber batten supporting the asbestos cement weatherboards, and at the top of the slide, still in vague focus, was the underside of the aluminium roof sheets in the overhanging eaves. The condition of the interior of some of the cottages was not good due to vandalism, but the damage had the benefit of allowing us to investigate some of the normally concealed parts of the structure of the cottage. The walls had double studs approximately every 1.2 metres, which indicated a possible panel system of construction of the house, of those walls, as these double studs did not align with openings or internal wall junctions where you would normally find double studs. The walls were sheeted behind the exterior timber boarding with bitumen impregnated building paper or sarking, and they were sheeted on the inside surface with a masonite-like hard board interior wall lining. There was no bulk wall insulation. Now, these are the before photos, and Miles Lewis showed you the after photos. Cottage number 5 in Middlehead Road even included the original kitchen cupboards with fold-out ironing board and exhaust hood built into the cupboard above the stove, which we considered to be unusual for government-provided housing in the early 1950s. Simple tubular Bakelite interior door handles were extant, and their fully mortised locks had curved fore ends. The original exterior door handle and lock still survived on the well-built heavy front door, which was again of greater thickness and higher quality than in similar post-war government housing, due to the inclusion of cold climate insulation within the door, as we discovered later. The door hinges also hinted at a non-Australian origin with their curved corners. The hinges also contained a stamp, which is not clear in this photograph, but they're there, and of an interlocking V and upside down V in the letters ASSA, as well as Sweden. ASSA, or ASA, was established in Sweden in 1881 by Augustus Stenman, his initials AS being reversed to create the palindrome ASSA, and joined with the Finnish firm Åmåls in 1994. ASA Åmåls still supplies the Australian market. The inscription is proof that the hinges are Swedish and indirect evidence that the houses could have been of Swedish origin. The documentary evidence of the ASA houses as drawn in the Commonwealth Department of Works and Housing comparative drawing, the 4-sheet drawing, and the physical evidence of the extant original door furniture and hardware, and the kitchen cupboards enable us to conclude in 2003 that the houses were, more likely than not, to have been prefabricated houses made by the Swedish ASA company. Before I mention further documentary evidence as part of the comparative analysis, we were able to find reference to similar houses at the former Ingleburn Army Base's residential area, Ingleburn Village in southwestern Sydney. There we were able to photograph ASA houses and Raleigh-Newsome houses. A resident informed us that as the houses became vacant, they were being demolished, an example of which we were able to witness. Today, all the houses and all the streets have been obliterated, and the site lies adjacent to the newly built Edmondson Town Centre and train station in Sydney's southwestern suburbs in the growth corridor leading to the new Western Sydney Airport. Our conclusion in 2003 was that the Georges Heights houses were rare in New South Wales and should be retained and conserved, and that in addition to their rarity, they are a tangible reminder of the post-war, Cold War military build-up in Australia as expressed by National Service. The Sydney Harbour Federation Trust conserved 4 of the Middlehead Road houses and demolished 3 of them, 1 at the south end and 2 at the north end, to increase the image of bushland when entering the road down the site. And it has to be remembered that we were fighting a preconceived idea that the site should be returned as much as possible to their original pre-European, pre-military state, which was at loggerheads to their cultural significance. The 4 remaining houses, so that's the exterior of the conserved houses. And the 4 remaining houses were refurbished for the short-term tourist rental market in the days before the existence of Airbnb, but they are now let as long-term rentals, and they serve as helping us with our housing shortage in New South Wales. And I noticed the Maserati 4-wheel drive in one of their driveways. Whilst undertaking our World Wars I and II site study in 2005 for the New South Wales Heritage Council, we came across more ASA houses in the Littleton area of Lithgow, west of the Blue Mountains. They were erected as part of the post-war staff housing for the Lithgow Small Arms Factory, and 11 of them still remain interspersed with other types of prefabricated or pre-cut houses that we did not identify. Now, as I mentioned earlier, as an aside, we also, Lithgow is also the location of an important collection of very small asbestos cement-clad duration cottages, which, as I said in the question time before, were erected for the duration of World War II. And they were erected for the armaments workers. So there's quite a large collection in Lithgow, and there's also a collection in Orange and Bathurst, as well as St Mary's in Sydney, near the major armaments factory that used to be there. The Orange and Bathurst areas are now heritage listed as statutory heritage conservation areas, so they remain and are still being used and loved, but these ones in Lithgow aren't in any conservation area. A few years ago, we uncovered additional documentary evidence in the form of the English language ASA catalogue. The managing director of ASA, Eva Nordstrom, stated in the catalogue's foreword that ASA had established a company in Melbourne, Åmåls, which we've heard of already, to assist the Commonwealth in meeting the post-war housing needs, and that the company was able, and this is important, to assist clients by working with the client's preliminary sketches to achieve a finished product using the ASA pre-cut or prefabricated systems. Almost there. The ASA catalogue, in addition to floor plans and perspectives of some of the company's standard house types, such as this A3, so the ASA 302 used at Georges Heights and elsewhere in Australia, contains a wealth of detailed technical information. And that information includes wall section details and plans of the 3 standard wall types that were available to suit different climate ranges, from Malmo, which is the top of the 3 wall sections there, with no insulation, through Gothenburg to Stockholm, with the highest level of insulation. The Georges Heights houses, based on what we observed, appear to have had the lowest level of insulation, Malmo, that is, no wall insulation other than the intrinsic insulation value of solid timber cladding. And must also be mentioned as an aside that this catalogue did include details for the North American market, specifically to comply with the Department of Housing and Development in America, so that they were aiming at the North American market as well. Oh, and before I go on, it was also worth mentioning that the National Archives files contain correspondence regarding the treatment of the timber on these houses, because these houses were built out of softwood. The joists were softwood, everything else was softwood above the bearers. The bearers and the brick piers were provided by the local contractor here in Australia, and the rest came in a flat pack from Sweden. So they impregnated their timber with hylosan to stop insect attack and decay. In 2003, 50 years after the house's construction, we noted the fungal attack on the softwood floor joists, probably explained by the fact that hylosan had an effective life of only 20 years. The chemical was banned in the 1970s, and the residues of that chemical were found underneath the houses. Oh, sorry. And the catalogue also contained these standard details of doors and cupboards, kitchen cupboards, etc. But unfortunately, the ironing board cupboard and the exact front door that we used in Mossman were not. The front door was very similar to the AD1, the one on the top left, but didn't have the window in it. In conclusion, a small factory on the western shore of Sweden's largest lake, Lake RENEE, was able to supply thousands of houses to Australia to assist in alleviating the Commonwealth government's post-war housing shortage for critical workers at military and armaments establishments. Despite the factory's small size, as you can see in the photograph on the left, and the handmade nature of the fabrication process, as you can see in the main photograph. Given Ivar Nordstrom's comments in the ASA catalogue and the similarity of the plan of the ASA Type 302 house to the Riley Newsom CA1 type house, I would propose that the prefabricated house manufacturers worked with the Commonwealth Works and Housing architects to provide houses based on a plan determined by the Commonwealth architects, but altered to suit the prefabrication systems of the individual manufacturers, with the important modification of a reduced ceiling height from 9 foot to 8 foot in the case of the ASA houses built at Georges Heights. Again, this still requires documentary evidence, including examining the sequence of drawings by ASA and the Commonwealth and the correspondence between the Commonwealth and ASA to be able to confirm the origin of the design of the ASA houses erected in Australia.
We might get the other two speakers up so we can share the microphone for questions. So Renee and Daniel, do you want to stay here and we can pass that round? So I think we've got a mic, Theo, for questions because people on Zoom weren't hearing the questions. Questions from the floor first. We're not. Okay, Anoma and I will also have a question. Yep. So I have a question for Renee.
Thanks.
Renee, so you spoke about these debates that they were having at their meetings. And I'm keen to know, I mean, have you looked at them yet in detail?
No,
Not
no,
yet.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of interested in knowing whether to what extent they were driven by political positions and ideology,
I mean,
as opposed to pragmatics or...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably both that were informing that, but yeah, I haven't really kind of delved into all the departmental kind of communication. But if we look at the similar kind of setup, we say, for example, migrant and refugee on arrival accommodation, it is both a mixture of economic, practical kind of considerations, and then, a kind of glossary of left and right politics are being played out a little bit in that period.
And then in relation to the Cold War, how Australia is positioning itself, especially in the region, which is kind of so influenced by.
Yeah, and so that's really what I want to kind of investigate further, is that impact of that kind of history on how it frames kind of the housing projects that are coming out of the Commonwealth Housing Department of Housing and Works in the 1950s. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I just pop in a question, probably to all of you, but Daniel, you mentioned at the beginning a motivation of sort of medicalising housing, particularly, and you mentioned the housewife, and I was kind of interested if you could elaborate a bit on that in terms of, was this meant to be a more efficient house? And also, I think for both of you, how do kitchens, the prefabrication of kitchens, fit into the supply of the houses and what you know?
Okay, well, Queensland had this obsession with housewives, and it's part of it goes to the role of Queensland as a tropical settler colony. So this was about reproducing the settler body. So if women were not feeling comfortable at home, there was tests. This is sort of interwar. There were discussions about the effect of temperature on menstruation and fertility and all of this, and they were being taken really seriously. Most likely, people weren't having sex because they were wrecked, and it wasn't necessarily temperature and that. But the doctors were not kind of quite as sort of getting into that. So there's that part, and I think this, in one sense, it's not as explicit in from what I can see in the discussion about the needs of women, but it had been explicit in the 20s and 30s, and the projects that were there, many of the same people were actually involved in it. And some of it also goes into the fact, I guess, that you have places like University of Queensland trying to prove their relevance to the state. So they play up white Australia and they play into that sort of trope at that stage often to allow things to happen. I haven't looked at the kitchen and the design of that, but I think it's a really good point. Yeah.
Just in terms of the design of the kitchen, in the ASA house, you probably noticed in the plans, also in the Commonwealth House and in the Thoroughly Newsroom, there was a direct connection between the kitchen and the dining area. They were one room separated by a kitchen bench with a refrigerator module to provide some sort of spatial definition, but they were in fact one room. So I think that was an interesting development in this Swedish planning. But then again, I don't know whether that planning came from the Commonwealth architects and was fed to ASA and to Riley Newsom, whether that was something that was coming from Europe. That's something that should be researched.
Yep. Okay, another question. Sorry, one more.
Sorry, just to add, I just forgot. The other part actually was discussion of fatigue. And so that's actually where it really comes in. And the interesting part is that then you actually have Royal Navy research that was happening in Singapore on fatigue in battleships, actually then getting translated by DHK Lee into the design of, into questions of temperature and fatigue for housewives.
Another question, Paul, and then Miles.
Daniel, you mentioned PNG. Can you see differences played out in colonial Australian house design and PNG and housing for tropical Queensland in terms of the Queensland expectations of, you know, the housing being acclimatizing white people to tropical life, when that seems not to, would presumably not be such an issue in PNG?
It's not something I've looked into in so much detail. I've chatted informally with Philip. I actually think PNG is a major project that needs to happen, largely because in some ways there's been a number of us looking at Queensland for the last number of years in terms of that settler colony. Darwin, you know, has also been looked at, and you can see that really as a military enclave. But there's the Australia's informal empire. You know, that's the three tests of different forms of colonization around the same time. And so that's really the part, I guess, you can look at PNG or Cook Islands in terms of as a mandated territory and really as kind of the exploitation colony there. And I think it's really important to understand then later, a lot of this fits into rhetorics about climate that we see, say, and the myth also of it that you see in, say, Glenn Murcutt's work as well, and other things, or Peter Stutchery getting a go doing a mission, you know, a house for his uncle as a missionary in that. So those parts, that kind of part hasn't really been pulled out. I could see the openings of a few bits, but, you know, looking at kind of questions around labor and who's making it and all of that is really interesting. And the other part too is that I've made the point to Philip that architecture history kind of professionalizes at the moment that PNG is kind of gains independence. So we've not really incorporated histories of Papua New Guinea into Australian architecture history, even though there's a whole sort of sense at particular moments that this forms part of the, you know, the government remit. So yeah, it's a really big project that should happen.
Add that a lot of the internal publications that were put out for the Public Works Department showcased projects that were being done in PNG of both housing and schools and institutions as part of a kind of end of year reports. So it goes right back to World War I. The New Zealand design for Burns Hill.
Yeah.
And they were designed.
Right. Miles?
I'm hoping to be allowed to ask two questions while I have this machine in my hand. But the first was to Daniel, related to that last point. There's a history of houses being exported from Townsville to PNG, so there was that direct connection. But my question is, given this image about the tropical house, And given the fact that Weller wrote elsewhere about cyclone protection, I don't see any evidence of cyclone protection in these houses at all. Is that the case or not?
Yeah, I'd need to look into it a bit more. Sometimes you can see a few mentions of cyclone protection. I think I'm thinking more of Benny Burnett's work. There might have been some discussion, but not. It wasn't. I mean, like you're looking at Roy Grant's stuff for Huxley and that. I mean, he adds a bit of insulation, and that seems enough. So I don't know how aware people were of tropical conditions. Yeah. I
wasn't sure if that Roy Grant's was a genuine attempt at a tropical building at all. It was a covert attempt to get into the Wimmera market, because Wimmera is semi-secret, and the manufacturers are negotiating around, not sort of saying they're trying to get there.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Anyway, sorry. My second question, if I may, was to Scott. The catalogue, which you very kindly sent me a copy of, says, as you said, they're looking at the American markets, and that may seem to conflict with what I said before, because I don't know of any houses going from Europe to America. Do you know that any houses went, in fact, in the end, to the American market from ASA?
Can I give a Miles answer? No, I don't know.
Okay.
I've got no idea, but that's a good question.
Yes. We know that they previously sent houses to Saudi Arabia for the oil workers, so they had got a broader market. Yeah.
Mm.
I think there's time maybe for one online question. Theo, do you want to pick a winner?
So we've just got a question for RENEE from Catherine Townsend. So it says, the Menzies government eliminated many of the Commonwealth Housing Commission's initiatives. Why do you think that the Commonwealth Experimental Building Station was one of the initiatives they continue to support and fund?
I can't answer that, but it's a very good question. And I think, yeah, it is something to kind of think about. I mean, I think it's probably because it was involved in other research outside of housing, maybe. That's just a kind of guess. I mean,
I don't, but there's one interesting point that I did come across, which was about maintaining scientific capacity in terms of war, because I know that there was some documentation I come across where the DHK Lee, the physiologist, is sort of struggling after World War II to actually keep on researchers that had been affiliated with the military. So he then sort of tags across, and he's sort of suggesting with the Korean War, we need to be ready, and we need therefore to have this sort of thing going on. So my sense, there's an element of some of that there, but I'd have to check in terms of temperature or time. So
just like to add probably a cynical comment that the Menzies government supported the Commonwealth Experimental Building Station because the government was paying for a very valuable research into the building industry, which, you know, as a student in the 1970s, was still using the material, so that the mates of the Liberal Party didn't have to fund it themselves through personal and company research and development. So it formed a very, very important source for builders and architects.
I think we better wrap up, but that was a terrific session. Just join me in thanking the speakers again.